Well, I believe we can now start. Gomer, is that correct?
Yes, let's start. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks very much, Gomer. Thank you for that wonderful opening, and to the ISEA comms team for preparing us all for today's wonderful session. My name is Kathleen Diga, and I am the co-lead of the Local Access and Community Networks Initiative at the Association of Progressive Communications, or APC. I am actually here based in rainy Durban, South Africa, and I will be moderating today's webinar. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Today is session number 3 of the Community Networks Learning Series. It's a series that is co-organized by Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism, Social and Community Enterprises, the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, and APC. And today's session is titled Bridging the Gap, Addressing Policy, Regulation, and Governance of Community Networks. And I really look forward to it. We have a wonderful array of speakers coming from Spain, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. And it also looks like our participants are also from all across as well, notably the ones that I've just listed, also from sectors from social enterprise, government, academia, non-governmental organizations. I'm very much looking forward to the participation of you all. Just to recap that our first session was around 3 case studies from the Global South of community networks. So we had a demonstration from the Zenzaleni Network in South Africa, Common Room in Indonesia, as well as some cases from Mexico from our colleague Carla from Redes. And then we had moved on to a second session, which looked specifically at Asia, at some of the challenges. I would also say some of the benefits of community networks during that session, and a lot of cases from India and Myanmar. And a few words that alluded with me was from Prof. Albert saying community networks in terms of social impact. It is a problem that social entrepreneurs also face. The question is, do I scale deep for doing more within community networks or within the community, or do I scale wide so that the innovation can be diffused to many more communities? So these 2 sessions now complement this third one, which is around policy and regulation. And we know that during the pandemic, it became a lot more apparent the importance of digital inclusion when children had to come online to go to school. Hospitals and government had to share pertinent health information to its constituents. And I believe that governments now have recently needed to do a bit of a rethink in their approach of those who are being left behind without the means to connect. Students that had to connect with their teachers virtually. How do businesses bring their customers their most needed goods during these difficult times? So the question really is what types of policy and regulation would be possible to provide a more enabling environment for social entrepreneurs or groups who want to make a difference in their communities, particularly around connectivity. And I've been working with this project since 2017, and it's just become a lot more apparent that community-driven initiatives or community networks have been about connecting the unconnected and enabling a lot of remote areas so that they can bring connectivity to their communities. So let's bring this learning session to a start. It'll provide a space to provide insights and present proposals on policies and governance around digitization and community networks. I believe we would like to first do a photo session. So Gomer, if you can direct me a bit, I believe you'd like everyone to turn on their cameras if they wish, so that we can have a photo all together.
Yes, that's true, Kathleen. Asking assistance from Bads and Anton for the photo session.
Okay, just waiting for a few seconds. Okay, our speakers are on video right now. So, okay, let's do it now. We have 2 pages. So, smile everyone for a few seconds. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Next page. Keep on smiling, guys. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, got it.
Well, that's
Back to you,
really a nice
Kathleen.
way. Thank you, Gomer. What a really nice way to start, because then I got to see who's on the call, and lovely to see some of your faces. Thank you very much for doing so. Well, what I will do now is I will introduce our first speaker, and it is of great pleasure that I introduce Carlos Rey Moreno. He is actually a colleague of mine at the Association for Progressive Communication, and we co-lead the Community Networks initiative together. And so I would like to, there he is, I see him on screen. So as part of the what we call the LockNet initiative, he specifically also coordinates the policy and regulatory work with the LockNet initiative. I mean, he really is a jack of all trades, to be honest. It's been such a great pleasure to work with him in the last 3-4 years. And apart from coordinating the policy program, he's been conducting a lot of the trainings with regulators around how policy can be more enabling for community-driven initiatives. And particularly in Africa, we've seen him work with a lot of the regional associations. And you can also find him in the authored reports and submissions of a lot of the public consultations around any policy dealing around community networks. And I think without any further ado, I'd pass the mic on to Carlos.
What can I say? What can I say? Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Isha. Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me to give a presentation on this topic that, as Kathleen said, I've done a bit of work on. And it's an absolute pleasure to share anything that I could have found over the years with all of you. Because, well, we, as Kathleen has said, I've done a significant amount of work in Africa, trying to, well, myself and others and APC and our partners there, trying to create a more enabling environment for community networks. And it would be great that through these sessions with all of you, with, Ida, with Isha, with all of our partners, Tariq, in Asia, we are able to do something similar as well in the continent, no, in Asia Pacific. So anyway, let me. I prepared some slides that I would like to share with you. And please feel free to ask me any questions that you would like. Let me minimize this so you don't see that. Okay. So yeah, well, I guess you've heard from Kathleen a bit about APC. We are a member-based organization founded in the 90s, working on ICT for social justice. And we've been doing quite a lot of policy work, well, community networks work, to be honest, starting from the 90s, and then since 2017 with this initiative that Kathleen described. And within that, we've been doing quite a lot of work on policy and regulation for an enabling environment for community network, because we realized very early that without an enabling policy and regulatory environment, the possibilities of community networks to thrive were very much reduced, no? And we've been doing training with regional regulatory authorities in Africa in particular, but also in Latin America with Comtelca. And we are an ITU sector member, so we participate in a lot of the ITU processes, from the World Telecommunications Development Conference to the Global Symposium for regulators, the Council Working Group, and many other regional spaces, again, mainly in Latin America and Africa. And we also participate in a lot of public consultation and technical assistance wherever possible, contributing with research about other practices that we have identified in different countries, in different jurisdictions that could be considered enabling of community networks. And a lot of it comes from this, or was included on this research that we published in 2020, where we identified 5 barriers and international good practices to address them around operator licensing, spectrum licensing and fees, backbone and backhaul infrastructure, financial support, and access to network infrastructure. And I'm going to go a bit about this. I mean, we keep on updating this research because there are new regulations that keep on coming. There are new things that we discover, that changes that come about, that, you know, it might be considered dated because things are fluid and changing all the time. But we, as I will, in my last slide, I will point you to a place where we keep updating this research. So first of all, I would like to point to you to the recognition of community networks in international policy documents, right? I guess the most important one is the ITU recommendation 19 from the World Telecommunication Development Conference, where it mentions the need to that it's important to consider small and non-for-profit community operators in order to provide broadband connectivity to users in rural and remote areas. That it includes issues of radio spectrum, licensing activities, training, etc. No? And then over the last couple of years, there has been other documents that have also included the importance of community networks. No? This is one of the study groups from the ITU development sector that focuses on telecommunications and ICTs for rural and remote areas, where one of the main lessons learned mentions that community networks are an important part of connectivity ecosystems, and they help bridge the digital divide. Also, the online global symposium for regulators from last year, in their best practice guidelines, it talks about the regulatory tools that promote local innovation ecosystem and provide incentives for the participation of small and community networks in deploying low-cost rural networks, and then in issues related to spectrum innovation, where they talk about spectrum sharing and the need to share those resources. I will get a bit more into that, but including releasing a spectrum for the establishment of community networks on a technology neutral basis. In Asia, thanks to ISOC and in collaboration with UNSCAP, there has been 2 summits on community networks. The first one was in 2019 in Bangkok. The second one was online in 2021. And there has been, different stakeholders coming to the fore in discussing elements of policy and regulation of community networks in the region. But I will let others to speak about that because they know much more than I do. So first of all, operator licensing. Well, I'm gonna take you to some examples around the world. I guess one that I feel particularly proud about is the licensing of community networks in Kenya, as we assisted the Kenyan regulatory authority through this process via a public consultation, a draft framework on licensing and share spectrum. That then it went for public consultation, and then in October last year, the first license for community networks appeared as part of their unified licensing framework. And this license includes is exclusive for non-for-profit community-based organizations and non-governmental organizations. It has a very bounded and small geographical scope. It comprises in many regulatory frameworks or licensing frameworks. There is a license for infrastructure and a licensing for providing services, and all of them have a lot of compliance requirements in this one is just one single license for both. So the compliance for rural communities is reduced, which is absolutely critical. It is exempted from USF contributions, and it has some waivers around the usage of a spectrum. And it's super cheap. I mean, this is in Kenya shillings, but basically the application fee is around $10, and the operating fee is around $50, right? Which is a very small amount, which is required to, let's say, push or incentivize rural communities to get under the licensing framework. And it's going to have other benefits, as I will, or hopefully, as I will explain later on. In Africa, there are other countries where community networks are thriving, as you heard from Sol at the beginning on South Africa. There is a range of license exemptions that you can apply for. In Uganda, there is also a license, although it's way more expensive than this one. It's around $2,500, which means that communities cannot apply for it because it's super expensive. So we are working with the regulator on trying to reduce those fees. In Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, we are seeing licensing frameworks that are in draft format that are closer to the Kenyan one. So there are some evolution around it, but it's not only in Africa, right? In Latin America, both in Brazil, in Mexico, and Argentina, there are exemptions for a small amount for instead of the Kenyan one that bounds to a geographical administrative boundary where a community network can provide services. In Latin America, it is more around the number of subscribers or the number of people in those particular villages, right? And we have exemptions or particular licenses, as in the case of Argentina, for community networks. And then in other countries, especially in the European Union, in New Zealand, in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia, rather than a license per se, the market is way more liberalized, and you just need to declare your activity in the telecommunications sector, and then you are already a provider. No need for license fees. You need to comply with other elements on the company law and the tax law and whatnot, but a declaration takes you through the licensing of it. Then access to a spectrum. A spectrum is critical, right? Especially in rural and remote areas where there is no infrastructure. Accessing wirelessly and providing access wirelessly to yourself or to other communities is critical, no? So access to a spectrum is very important into creating an enabling environment for community networks. What we see around the world is that Wi-Fi is the technology that is used the most by community networks, especially because it is license exempt. You can use, I'm using Wi-Fi now in between my computer and the router in my house, and I don't pay any license to use that spectrum, right? We can use Wi-Fi spectrum to create communications networks without having to pay a fee. And Wi-Fi has a very interesting characteristic that has been exploited by some vendors, that by tweaking some parameters, you can actually establish relatively long links in the backhaul. I have established links of over 100 kilometers. So with Wi-Fi technology, and it's a very solid, stable, and super cheap. At the moment, many manufacturers are really bringing down the price of very, solid and high quality kits that you can use to set up Wi-Fi networks. And then, well, sorry for this strong transition, but then we have other spectrum, right? Other spectrum that is basically all of us are using mobile broadband, right? And the spectrum for mobile broadband is in the hands of very few companies, mobile network operators, that they bid for it. I mean, they pay a lot of money for it in the form of auctions, but it's not used by all of them in rural areas, right? The economies might mean that there are one or two, I mean, if there are, let's say, an average of 3 or 4 in every country that hold the spectrum, only one or two may be deploying networks in the most rural areas of the countries, right? And they are forced to meet by when they are awarded that spectrum to meet what is called coverage obligations. But they trade with that. They trade with the fines that they need to pay, because it's cheaper for them to pay the fines than to actually deploy infrastructure in rural and remote areas, right? So the desire for competition and affordability that national regulatory authorities require may need complementary models to use that spectrum efficiently in rural areas, right? Because what it means is that that spectrum is assigned to operators, but then is not used, right? And there has been innovations around the world around mobile broadband spectrum sharing. In the United Kingdom, well, there are many examples, right? But there are ways that that spectrum is being shared by the regulator with smaller actors, with different regulatory structures that really allow communities to deploy, or small operators to deploy, mobile broadband networks. So something that might be, like, it might sound a bit utopical. It does happen. It does happen everywhere around, well, in at least these countries around the world. And there are many innovations that could take place for that to happen in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, to enable even more communities, because Wi-Fi is great, but it has some limitations in terms of line of sight, in terms of range, in terms of getting to user devices, going through walls, etc., etc. Also, maintenance of the network with mobile broadband, you would set up one base station that would cover an entire community. With Wi-Fi, you need to really tweak and be designing every link to every house and make sure, and every single link is a point of failure. So it's a bit, you can do it. I mean, there are hundreds of community networks around the world that are doing it, but it's not the most efficient way. The thing is that there is no access to a spectrum, right? If we manage to get access to a spectrum, we could be talking about an entire different ballgame for community networks around the world. If we really want to close the digital divide, if there was really a willingness to do so, this would be one of the fastest way to do so. Because the problem is the pricing, right? Many operators are tailoring their prices for urban markets, and then people in rural areas cannot afford those prices to access that mobile broadband, right? So there are examples, right? As I was saying, in Mexico, one of our partners in LogNet and in many other initiatives, Rhizomatica, has managed to access LTE spectrum in partnership with the regulator, and has set up so far 17 community operators that are covering 80 plus localities in rural Mexico. Through our public submissions in South Africa, we've managed to get a spectrum sharing in the current licenses that are being awarded as we speak in South Africa, that has released a lot of mobile broadband these days. The only caveat is that it's going to take 5 years. So if operators don't use their spectrum in 5 years, then it will be shared with SMMEs and cooperatives to set up their network. It's not what we would have wished for, but at least there is something to get us regulators thinking that national exclusive spectrum licenses are to no avail. They don't contribute to close the digital divide. They contribute to many things, and I am one of the biggest users of mobile broadband, but they don't contribute to bridge the digital divide in rural and remote areas of, let's say, the Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. Another option I'm sorry to say, I mean, one example was Rhizomatica in Mexico. I believe in West Papua in Indonesia, there are also examples of networks that have been deployed with LTE technology, and that have been community networks that have had access to a spectrum that side. Another way that we are seeing community networks providing mobile broadband is through mobile virtual network operators, right? There are We are supporting an example in Mexico as well. And we see more and more that operators are willing, in order to increase their user base, to create a virtual operator on top of their network, and to partner with organizations that can reach other client base that they are not able to reach. Things here are around negotiation with them and pricing, but more and more regulators are forcing them to partner and are trying to regulate the pricing so it's not cannibalistic. We may see examples of this with the new wholesale mobile network in Malaysia, where potentially there is going to be more mobile virtual network operators benefiting from that. In Mexico, the example that we are supporting comes from a similar wholesale mobile broadband network that was deployed there, right? So individual operators might not be enticed to support this, but wholesale networks might be. And Malaysia is starting a new one, which might be the way forward. So just to go quickly into others, other support from regulators and policymakers would be accessing to funds. The easier or faster way would be through the universal service funds. The universal service funds are something that all operators have to contribute to, is kind of some sort of a tax, because it is acknowledged by everyone that they are not able to reach areas that are outside the market, outside their economic interest. So they put some money aside so the government or the regulator can do that. Normally, those projects were going back to those operators that were contributing to the fund, but we have some examples where that's changing. Argentina is the, I would say, the epitome for this, in the sense that last year they put $3 million aside from the USF for community networks projects, in between $3,000 and $100,000. A very, very interesting case that we will learn a lot from, and a very brave step from the Argentinian regulator. But there are other examples, right? There are community networks directly receiving USF funds in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Papua New Guinea. There are countries where non-for-profits could apply to the USF, such as Costa Rica, Peru, and within the Eastern Caribbean. And there are CNs receiving other financial public funds, like in South Africa, Indonesia, through the Village Fund, Georgia, Brazil, and the United States. In Kenya, thanks to the licensing framework that we managed to facilitate last year, there seems like in the new USF review, it's going to incorporate elements of the Argentinian case and make USF available for community networks as well. And then finally, although this is for a much longer conversation, access to infrastructure, as I was saying. I mean, we were talking about a spectrum and how important it is Wi-Fi and mobile broadband to reach the communities, but without backhaul, without actually managing to get to the fiber and from there connect to the rest of the internet, is quite impossible to do that, right? So access to infrastructure, in many cases, accessing to national research and education networks or other sort of public fiber, right? We have BharatNet in India, we have in Thailand, where the government have spent a lot of money on that public backhaul, the Palapa Ring in Indonesia. We do have a lot of examples, especially in Asia, where the government has used a lot of the resources to create that backbone and backhaul network. But then, first of all, what are the conditions to access it? And where is it? Let's map it. Let's be able to design and have that information as available as possible in global in geographical information systems, that we can easily and very quickly check where we are and can facilitate and can reduce the pricing of designing the networks, which is also very, very critical. A lot of time for me has gone into trying to find out where is the closer fiber, who owns it, what are the pricing, negotiated, so on and so forth. And that's draining, right? For people like myself and for the communities as well. Anyway, this is my last slide that is about resources, right? We are maintaining this wiki where we have data on country profiles, on good practices around the world that we update, on contribution to national public consultations, and in all these processes and the wording, the potential enabling wording that comes with them. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope I didn't extend myself too long. And yeah, I'm open to questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for that real overview of the type of elements needed for community networks to thrive, particularly around policy. I mean, what I pulled out of your session is that one, it is globally recognized that community networks exist in the international and regional spaces, and in wording within those policy documents as small and nonprofit community operators, or those promoting local innovation systems. And there are quite a few considerations that we needed to take in. You've given us examples of licensing for communities to be able to register and provide services, that there are governments that are designing specific regulations so that communities can set up their own at affordable prices. This concept of access to spectrum, while the majority are using Wi-Fi license exemptions, you've given us some wonderful examples of the headway that communities are making in order to access spectrum like 2G and 3G, 4G. You've also given us some great examples of financing for national governments now providing funding for community networks under the Universal Service Fund, as you mentioned, Argentina, and some potential in Kenya. And as well, that it is important for us to find the public information on the availability of connectivity, like in your example of fiber, so that communities know where those points are and then therefore can negotiate for lower prices for such connectivity. So thank you very much, Carlos, for a great presentation and introducing us to the concepts. I think we'll move then on to the next speaker, and who we have is Isha Suri, senior researcher at the Center for Internet and Society in India. She is a senior researcher here at the CIS, and her interests fall in telecom policy, competition law, internet governance, intellectual property rights, privacy, and data protection. She holds an LLB with a specialization in IP law and at IIT Kharagpur. And prior to this, she worked in digital economy startups and innovation team, and at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, a New Delhi-based think tank. Well, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, Isha, and the work at CIS. So please do take it away.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that kind introduction. And at the outset, let me just thank you for inviting me and delivering me this talk. I also want to thank APC because we, as Carlos mentioned, we've been working with them for the past 1 year, where we are trying to do a policy and a regulatory sort of a roadmap for Indian regulators. And in my presentation, I would be focusing more on the Indian sort of regulatory landscape, or lack thereof, as I like to put it. So give me a minute and let me just share my screen, and then we'll take this forward.
Great. And in the meanwhile, please do pose any questions you have in the chat box. And if you wish, you can also introduce yourself.
I hope my screen is up.
We can see it. Isha, looks great.
All right, great. So as I said, like, I would want to focus it from an Indian lens and pick it up from where Carlos left. And, one thing that really the keyword that stuck with me is how he began with the need for an enabling sort of a policy ecosystem. And in India, we've sort of been talking about how it's one of the fastest growing markets, world's second largest connected market. But what we seem to miss out is that we're also one of the largest disconnected populace or demography, so to say. And secondly, a majority of the Indian population that you see online is using a mobile broadband. So connectivity and meaningful connectivity is also a huge bridge that I feel we still need to sort of address. And in that, community networks, as we've also been sort of talking, it could be this piece in the puzzle that could help solve a lot of things. But one thing that I feel has really been missing is that it's not been recognized or acknowledged by the Department of Telecommunications or the regulator in India. What that essentially means is that you keep having these telecom policies. We've had 4 telecom policies up until 2018. And community networks has not been acknowledged by the regulator, even though the aim and objective has been time and again to bridge the digital divide. And in the past 2 national telecom policies, they've also talked about increasing broadband access. But peculiarly, community networks has been missing from each one of those discussions. There is no sort of a clear-cut definition of what falls within the ambit of CNs in India or outside the purview of CNs in India. And I do know that there'd be some people who'd be like, there was a TRI consultation in 2016 that did sort of hint at it. Interestingly, in 2016, TRI had taken out a paper that was looking at, as I said, proliferation of broadband access in India. And there they did talk about certain growing business models. And it was acknowledged that there are community-driven Wi-Fi models, such as community mesh networks, which have been deployed by several not-profit organizations. And they went on to also name or give examples of some community networks that exist in India, such as the one by DEF, by Air Jaldi. And that was it. It was more like an indicative, a referential sort of statement. But the recommendations per se did not mention community networks at all. And this is the 2016 paper I talked about. And it's been 6 years since then. We've had another national digital communications policy in 2018 that did not sort of acknowledge or hint at it. And why this is important is that whenever you have any sort of policies or guidelines then emanating out of the government or the regulator, there are no specific recommendations that cater to community networks. So some of the things that Carlos really mentioned about, right, like the USOF fund or exemption from spectrum fees, access to certain specific unlicensed spectrum bands. So CNs is not an identified category, and hence some of those schemes that they could really benefit from are peculiarly missing from availing those benefits that should rightfully be theirs. I think the Indian telecom story is a great tale to tell, and it will be one for generations to come, right from the time it liberalized in the 1990s to then 2016, when you had this a disruptor into the market that really caused a lot of financial distress. And to be fair, of course, on one hand, you felt that it's only the telecom service providers or the mobile operators that face the brunt of it. But I think what also got missed out in the cacophony is how it would impact the entire ecosystems or your smaller pies in this entire puzzle, such as the ISPs and the local operators. And I think that sort of discussion really never took off in India. So in 2012, the Supreme Court of India, I think, and it's a very famous judgment, most of you must have heard about it, where it was held to be a natural resource by the Supreme Court of India. They cancelled 122 licenses also, the great 2G scam that we call it back home. And they also said that any sort of spectrum would then have to be acquired only through an auction. Now that's fine, if you want to sort of what really happened and what we saw was that even then some of the legacy tax levies continued after the auction process. So you had the AGR, which was 8%, and there was also another litigation that happened. Apart from that, the service providers continued to provide a spectrum usage charge. And this was a relic of the erstwhile era where spectrum was being given on an administrative basis. So that really caused a lot of financial distress on the TSPs and a ripple effect on the downstream players. In terms of license exempt bands, again, there are very few and limited license exempt bands. The one in 2.4 to 2.48 is choked up, congested, and there is a definite need to de-license more spectrum bands. TRAI has repeatedly, in fact, asked for delicensing those spectrum bands. And I think there is a bit of, like, I would like to just backtrack a bit. So in India, you have these multiple stakeholders also sort of, regulating the space. So you have the DOT, which is looking at your spectrum and your licensing issues. And then you have the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, which is basically your regulator. But the regulator's remit or jurisdiction is only limited to tariff, interconnection, and quality of service issues. And TRAI, apart from that, also, as per the TRAI Act, can give you recommendations, and that it can make recommendations to DOT about licensing and spectrum issues. And how TRAI usually does that is that it has an open sort of a stakeholder consultation where it invites comments from various stakeholders, and it's prima facie, or ostensibly a more open sort of a consultative process. And I'll get into more about why I'm saying prima facie or ostensibly. And so during that time, TRAI has also had stakeholder discussions on delicensing of spectrum. And they have had stakeholders talk about how there is a need to delicense E and V band spectrum. And then back in 2014, TRAI made these recommendations to the DOT. And the DOT then has to act on those recommendations. And I mean, act on those recommendations, it's with the DOT has the power to either accept or not accept those recommendations. And as far as delicensing of E and V band spectrum is concerned, those recommendations have been lying. Up until recently, DOT has shown sort of no commitment towards following TRAI's recommendations. Last month, there was some news that the DOT has in fact agreed to delicensing E-band spectrum, and now the cabinet has to approve it. So the status up until now is also that these two spectrum bands have not been delicensed. Apart from that, so what if today I want to set up a community network? What are the regulatory sort of bottlenecks, hurdles, or hoops that I would have to jump over? So we have a unified licensing sort of a scheme, and it's supposed to be fairly straightforward, where you have three sort of different categories, which is the ISP category A, which is your national level, but it has very, very high entry fees. So the entry fee in itself can be quite prohibitive. And unless and until you have deep pockets and you're really big established national level players, you would not really be entering this area. The other is ISP category B license service area, which is only for the telecom licensed service areas where you can provide. And the fee is still lower, but it can be quite steep if you're looking at it for small sort of players or the NGO space and people who really are doing grassroots work. For them, it can be quite steep nevertheless. And the third is the ISP category C licensing, which is that you only have it for a local secondary switching area or the village level. And it is inexpensive comparatively. I mean, and also inexpensive per se, and it's most sought of after. But again, this is a blanket category. So something that could be explored could be that you want to have segregations or variations within these also. Say if you were to identify C and there's a business model or a cooperative sort of a model, then could the fees sort of go lower, or you just have a light touch registration requirement for them and exempt them from fees completely. And in terms of ISPs, also your ISP category C license providers also have to sort of pay 8% of AGR. Now, again, there is nothing wrong with them being taxed. But the funny thing about the Indian taxation system when it comes to telecom is that they've been treated like cash cows. So when I talk about their aggregated gross revenues, it means all the revenues that they earn, that a company earns. So for instance, I am an ISP category C license provider, but under that name of the company, the private company with which I've had the license registered, if I have any other work that I'm doing under that company name, and any revenue I earn from there would also fall under the AGR. And there was a long sort of a decade-long dispute that happened, and the operators were like, this is an arbitrary sort of interpretation of AGR. And they went out to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court again said that no, all your revenue has to come under this. And then it sort of can become a real impediment to smaller sort of players in the space. Apart from that, this is your I think, regulations or the laws or the policies that govern the ecosystem, there are also certain other bottlenecks that sort of creep up, The problem I personally feel with regulation, I mean, there is a fine line between over-regulation and just about right regulation, is that along with it comes a lot of onerous requirements, a lot of bottlenecks that really, really mar or hurt like the small time players who do not have the time or the money or the resources to invest in the sort of hurdles that come up. Right. So, for instance, if I'm a smaller player, I'll have to engage with all the regulatory bodies. I'd have to engage with DOT. I'd have to engage with TRI. The process in itself would take at a minimum of 3 months. And these sort of delays pile up. And that can also act as a deterrent for somebody who really wants to enter into the space and work in this space. Apart from that, there are also compliance level issues that, sort of crop up. Some are very practical in nature, and the others, like, say, stringent KYC norms, data retention policies. So if you have a local sort of a small sort of player, in some areas you do not even, these are like, areas which have real infrastructure sort of issues, access related issues. So, and this is also something that we found out as we were discussing with various stakeholders, how the one-time password, every time you want to authenticate, is actually very impractical at some of the areas that you are, because there is no network. You can wait all day for that SMS to arrive on your phone, but it never does come. So, and I think these are some of the practical issues also that have really been looked over or have not been taken into consideration. And that in itself has served as a real barrier in this taking off or, scaling up in India. Having said that, there are, and I'm up, the last session and the session before that, there are community networks in India. And the obvious question that sort of comes up is that what are the models that they are using, or, how are they operating? So mostly community models in India use line of sight or low cost Wi-Fi equipment. The other was also, I think, a sort of a pilot study that IIT Bombay did with Grammar, where you used TV white spaces. Again, this was just something that was given as a pilot study, but to this day, there is no formal regulatory framework for use of TV white spaces, even though a large amount of TV white spaces remains unutilized and can actually be a great sort of way to pivot this forward. The other was Air Jaldi, and Air Jaldi sort of established a company under called the Rural Broadband Private Limited, and they got a Class A license and became a service provider in I think 6 regions. So for them, but again, ISP Class A license, expecting a community network is really not practical or feasible, because it's something that I don't think, apart from these deep-pocketed national level players, anybody else can invest in, because the price is really steep. The other sort of policy, and I'll tell you why I mentioned this, is because and recently the DOT and the Government of India passed the Prime Minister Wi-Fi Access Network Interface, and the objective or the overarching goal was to provide broadband to public Wi-Fi. On paper, it does look like a very promising thing, but will the need for CNs continue to remain or not? And I think the important question then to ask is that what is it that PM1 is really seeking to do, and how is it doing it? So what it's seeking to do is that it's going to proliferate broadband to public Wi-Fi. And if you go back to some of the reasonings and objectives that the TRI, the DOT, the government has been giving, is that, India, again, it's like a mobile broadband economy. A lot of people haven't really tasted the flavor of, quote unquote, what a broadband access can do. And in this way, we'll sort of create a market in the rural areas where the 2 private players have refused to go, because, as Carlos mentioned, they say there isn't enough ROIs for us to sort of go into those markets. But the interesting thing about PM1 is that it says that you will have to still procure the backhaul through a licensed ISP or TSP. So in areas, where you do not have this, PM1 is not going to function. And it claims to be, see, again, an unbundled and a distributed model where you have a public data office and you have an office aggregator. And if you look at the website, what they've envisaged as an aggregator is also that you have these umbrella companies where multiple PDOs can be registered. And the example or the analogy that they've linked it to is like, you have these cab aggregators, you could have these branded public data office aggregators. These are words that I've picked up from the policy document. not created on my own. And you have these PDOs. But if the community or the village or the area where you're trying to set up PM1 does not originally have a backhaul infrastructure, you can't just set up a PDO. That's not going to happen. In that case, you would still need to have an ISP's category C license at the very least. If someone were to come and ask me, hey, I want to set up this community network in this village, how do I go about it? It again says that it has a light touch framework. Again, so you do not have to pay any registration fees. There isn't any licensing requirement. All you have to do is a PDO has to register with a PDOA. And then there is a central registry, which sort of the PDOA will give all this information to, which is under the government of India. That's how this is envisaged. Secondly, there are also certain implementation issues and challenges which have not been taken into account. So again, as I said, the one-time password, so I was speaking to this person who was telling me that the place where we work, the grassroots level work that we do, the nearest sort of space where you could get that mobile network is 20 kilometers out. So as I said, whenever policies are being made, at some level, I do feel that there is a disconnect between the grassroots reality and what really goes out on paper. And these are very real world challenges that will be an impediment to taking off of this scheme also. However, best intentions you might have had when you were conceptualizing it. So it also remains to be seen whether PM1 will really be able to solve the sort of problems it set out to solve in the first place. Coming back to policy gaps, number one is there is limited awareness regarding community networks in India. And I mean, especially amongst policymakers. And we've sort of had conversations with the regulators and policymakers who may have heard of some sort of a CN being in India, but there really isn't enough sort of information around it, even within their own circles. And so what really happens is, unless and until they are there in the room, or you've sort of made that dent with the policy makers, you really cannot expect an enabling sort of a guideline or a policy coming your way. And I think that has really been a challenge in India. So for instance, since 2016, you've had one statement and some policy document or the other, but that really has not led to any sort of change within the ecosystem. Then there is a lack of acknowledgement, and how that affects, as I said, there are no policies that have favored CNs, like allocation of specific spectrum, earmarking reserves from the USOF has really not happened. I mean, USOF funds, you can't, to this day, and linking it to CNs, I haven't even seen any commentary that sort of talks about the two in popular sort of newspapers and national dailies in India. And I think that really is a challenge that we need to bridge. Again, about underutilized USOF. In India, 50% of the USOF has remained largely unutilized. And there are a few issues in the design and I think the implementation of USOF per se and in its isolation also. First thing is that, with USOF is also under the government, and the fund is also administered. So there is a sort of a lack of accountability process, because you have a government incumbent, which is the BSNL, and you also have an administrator. So who is accountable to whom? That has been like a big challenge. There haven't been stringent enforcement of penalties against contracts. And the third thing is that the funds haven't been properly ring-fenced. So what really happens is that you have to then make a request that every time you want to spend these funds, you make a request that goes to the parliament for approval, you give your reasons. And there is always going to be a delay when you have these sort of hurdles in place. So the other sort of option that could be explored is that could you just ring fence it and say, okay, this much would be spent here, this much would be spent there. And the government of India has to really fix its USO problem soon, because the operators now have started crying hoarse. They've said that 50% of the fund is underutilized. Why are we still being asked to pay a percentage of our revenues when the one that we've already paid is not being utilized? And what's the point? And the other thing that they say is that why is it on me to invest in the rural areas, because I've already given you a share of my revenues to do the needful, and that hasn't happened. The other thing is that as I remember, I said that the policy making is consultative by design when it comes to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Having said so, and this has also been my experience, and where I feel that access to policymakers really makes a huge difference. So if you, and there have been some sort of research also that have been taken by some researchers where they've started off with, these are a set of recommendations that TRI put out. And then you had stakeholder comments that were crowdsourced and funneled in. But there was hardly any time when TRI reversed its sort of decision. Second thing is that the access that these big telecom service providers have to the regulator is in no way matched to the other sort of civil society and grassroots level workers. We do not have that sort of access. And so the next question is, but does that access really lead to policy change? And the answer is, even if it doesn't, it does lead to a lot of delays. So when for instance, the E and V band spectrum, it's actually the the telecom operators who are saying that, this is not okay, but because it will create a distorted playing field, we have to pay the sort of revenues where you'll have these internet or the OTT players coming into the space, and they will not be required to pay the same amount of licensing fees. And by virtue of being able to do that, by virtue of the access that they have, they've really delayed the process by years. The same thing happened with PM Money. PM Money actually, even though it came out in 2020, the discussions had happened, and there was also a sort of a pilot that the government had started, but then it again went into this delayed sort of a process because they said they should have a license. Why are we getting the license? And some of those claims are really outrageous because you own the network. These players do not own the network. But just by virtue of the access that they enjoy, they are able to really delay some of these pertinent and imminent policy changes that we need to bridge the digital divide in India. Then there is a definite sort of a need to increase unlicensed spectrum, rationalizing of licensing fees. Again, it is something that even the government in its national digital communications policy has had hinted at, but we've not seen any sort of a meaningful outcome of some of those discussions. And last, as Carlos said, a discussion that we should probably park for later is that there is a definite need to bolster the existing infrastructure. And infrastructure mapping is, again, a great sort of a way where we could do that in India. Again, as the BBNL, there is hardly any information available. The only thing you can see is that where the fiber has been laid, you do not know how many are. I mean, there isn't information around how that's working. In terms of infrastructure sharing, that acts as a huge barrier. If I don't know what the gaps are, or if I could share the infrastructure with the other sort of service provider, is that an option that can be explored or not? There are also right-of-way issues that need to be sorted, and these are the sort of issues that definitely need to be addressed if you're really serious about bridging the digital divide in India. With this, I'd stop here. My colleague Abhishek Raj has done a great job of summarizing all the policy and telecom-related policy in India, and it's available on our website. Please feel free to, visit it. And I would recommend somebody who really wants to get a deep dive into the Indian sort of telecom policy landscape to have a look at it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Isha, for that presentation and giving us really the policy realities and its application in India. Really, it's an eye-opener on, what Carlos presented on the possibilities, the open possibilities of futures around, policies that would be enabling for community networks. And then we see some of the realities that, as you said, TRI, while they acknowledge it, that community-driven Wi-Fi models, such as community mesh networks, they acknowledge it, but in practice, there are no specific recommendations to support CNs. You gave us examples of the overload of some of the license-exempt areas and, some of the categories of licensing that exists. And then really, today's most recent policy of the PM Wani in 2020, some of the its offers, but as well what may be a disconnect with the grassroots communities, as you said, and the policies. Although you think that it's been developed for its best intentions, there will definitely be some barriers for a lot of the grassroots organizations to be able to access. And there is a question here from Michael, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind typing in your response, Isha, about the if there were any successes with PDOs or DPOAs under the PM WAMI scheme in India. So please do feel free to type your response to
I'll
them.
do
But
that.
thank you again. Wonderful. Thanks, Isha. And to the CIS India colleagues, Abhishek, for as well on working on that document that was mentioned that gives a bit more understanding of all the policy that exists. So in that note, I'd like to then move over to our next speaker. We are now going over to Indonesia. We have a professor. We have Professor Ida Widyaningsi from Universitas Padjadjaran. Sorry if I pronounced that poorly, but I am very aware of this university as it's a partner with us alongside Indonesia's Common Room Community Networks. She's an associate professor at Public Administration Department and the head of graduate programs in public administration at the University UNPAD, as we can say in short form in Indonesia. And she also serves as a senior researcher at a Center of Decentralization and Participatory Development Research. And she holds her PhD from Flinders Institute of Public Policy and Management at Flinders University, Australia. And her real main interests in research are in public administration and development issues. I'm very much looking forward to listening to this talk because we've been working with our Indonesian partners for a while now. So we'll now move to the case of Indonesia and policy of enabling environments for community networks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Let me share. Okay, I try to make it as quick as possible. Hang on a second. Oh, sorry. I should start it from the beginning. Sorry. I had to stop sharing and start it from the beginning. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. We'll have for each of our speakers around 15 minutes. And if you have questions from participants, please do type it in the chat box so that our speakers will be able to respond to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I will share the work of our team with Common Room. So some of the issues actually similar with what Carlos and Isha mentioned on the policy framework and enabling policy environment. So I put the title as Trajectory of Community Network in Indonesia, Policy Framework and Grassroots Movement, because I think that we still have lots of work to do regarding the community network. So this is how I will organize my talk. I will talk a little bit about the overview of internet development in Indonesia, the progress and challenge, and the rise of community network, initial finding of our research and conclusion. So what happened in Indonesia actually similar with what actually happening around the world, that the growing number of population who are using internet also happening in Indonesia, but the same problem also happen in Indonesia in terms of digital divide and what is actually happening to the people that actually had no access to internet. So as Carlos mentioned, and if we are talking who are the most disconnected people, and Indonesia apparently on the list, So this is why Common Room and partners are working together to try to address this issue. And surprisingly, at this moment, Common Room is the only institution in Indonesia, NGO in Indonesia, who has concern on this. This is why around several weeks ago, we proposed a policy recommendation for Indonesia presidency G20, because we would like to discuss this issue in the very important event. So Indonesia has a total population around a very big one, more than 277.7 million. And Indonesia, 49.7% actually female. But Indonesia never changed the composition of the population, because most of the population actually live in urban area, and the rest of them living in rural areas. About the internet in Indonesia, actually, I think we think that Indonesian internet regulation is still a little bit what we call as monopoly, because there is the regulator for internet, only one institution called Indonesian Telecommunication Regulatory Authority under the Ministry of Communication and Informatics. So the national policy and regulation on information and communication technology in Indonesia actually started to take shape in around 1963. This is a long time ago. And the government enacted an act number 5 in 1964 on telecommunication. However, if we are talking about community network, there are some recent most significant policies on ICT development in Indonesia, including Law Number 36, 1999 on telecommunication. So this law insists that actually Indonesia has a competitive ecosystem and reduce the role of the state in managing this sector. So within this law, actually there are more stakeholders involved in telecommunication service. So public, private, and cooperatives, actually 3 institutions recognized in this law. And in 2000, Indonesian government also implement a new telecommunication regulation. And in 2008, there is also a new regulation on information and electronic transaction. This is actually related to the how Indonesia can deal or overcome negative impact of global communication technology and development to economic and trade in the country. And the latest regulation that actually influenced the way community network managed at local level related to the regulation enacted by the Minister of Village Development of Disadvantaged Regions. And this is about the priority of village fund allocation and the possibility of village-owned enterprises to be a telecommunication service provider. So a long time ago, only 3 big ones, including cooperative. Now the government recognized another institution that actually can be the provider of the internet. So in Indonesia, actually the development of the internet related to the infrastructure development that actually funded by the government. So Carlos also mentioned about the Palapa Ring project. This is one of the Indonesia priority infrastructure project that actually started to build in 2016 to 2019 period. So this fiber optic cable network stretches across 13,000 kilometers onshore and also 22,000 kilometers offshore. And this is provide fast broadband internet to Indonesian in both urban and rural area across the country. So at this moment, it is recorded that at least 90 Indonesian district or local government and also municipalities connected to this fiber optic. Beside the infrastructure, Indonesian government also concerned about another program. So Indonesian government introduced the national movement on digital literacy called Gerakan Nasional Literasi Digital on the 16th of April 2021. This is about digital literacy and skill. So it is interesting because when the government introduced the different policies, actually Indonesian has access to internet, but the knowledge, the skill across the people actually different. Apparently, this movement is not because the government really care about the community, but this is also very political because there are so many hoax on the internet through different social media. So the government want to tackle that issues because there are so many political pressures on the government and also many different information on the internet. This is also related to the COVID-19 pandemic information that actually coming from different direction and making the community confused. But apparently the digital skill literacy to our knowledge is only limited to some activities that's actually not really touching the real people. This is only kind of a series of webinars conducted by several experts from university with a very limited number of people attended the event. So this is why Common Room think that we got to do something and working directly with the community. And because of the problem of digital divide in Indonesia, the government also actually open to work with some civil service organization. For example, Relawan TIK, this is the voluntary based internet computer expert, face-based admin in Papua, ICT Watch, SafeNet, and many different institutions, including Common Room. So, internet user in Indonesia actually around 73.7% of total population. However, we think that most probably, this number is not really actual internet user figures because of the existence of community network. So this is only the formal number that actually released by certain institution. So with the huge number of population, Indonesia has 4 biggest telecommunication company, and this company is not really working in small area or rural or disadvantaged region. They are mostly operated in bigger city. This is why community network actually has some room to develop in Indonesia. So as I mentioned earlier, the current COVID pandemic actually also forced a radical shift of human activities into more internet-based services. So the various mode of online education platform, home office activities, and also digital business are mostly used to limit direct social contact related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is why the need of internet actually getting higher. So at least we identify 4 main public services that actually changing in regard of COVID-19. Firstly, public services. So Indonesia has 83,218 villages, but at this moment, 12,548 of the village actually have no internet access due to the lack of infrastructure. So we still have so many people have no access to the internet. And another thing is actually education service during pandemic. So at least 42,000 students in West Java province only have no access to online learning material. Somehow the government restricted students to come to school and encouraged the teacher to teach online, but apparently the student has no access to internet at all. So this is becoming a big concern of the community that probably our level of education actually become problematic. And I also noticed when I conducted some field research, some of the primary school students couldn't read at all because they had to stay home for quite a while and they had no access to the internet. And another issue, another public service also related to the health service during COVID-19 pandemic. Indonesian government, for example, also set up a new application during the COVID to enable people to move around from one place to another, including in the big festival. So for some people who has no access to internet at all, it is almost impossible for them to travel to different area. And another issue, the last one, is actually economic recovery. So Indonesia actually had a plan, and actually Indonesian president thinking that they want to make Indonesia become the biggest digital economy. However, at this moment, 68% of the total population have access to digital economy, but the rest of them actually has no access at all. So what is actually happening in Indonesia? Actually, when we talk about the community network in Indonesia, Indonesia actually have started this network very long time ago, but when we talk about how to sustain the practices, how accessible and what's the situation of community network, it is still a very long road to formal recognition from the government. So anyone who doing research on Indonesian community network will name Ono Purbo. He is actually the founding father of community network in Indonesia. In 1990s, actually at the time he was a student, and he started to think critically that internet in Indonesia was very expensive at that time. So he came with the idea on building an internet warung. Warung is a small shop in Indonesia, and he started it at a university at his own campus. And then he took it out of the university and start to implement the model of internet warung or warnet in a neighboring area. So there is a network called RT-RW-Net or Neighborhood Internet Service developed in the mid-1990s. So this, because of the need of the internet, at that time, the growing number of RT-RW-Net developed in Indonesia, but there are so many challenges in terms of the monopoly of the internet service provider. So at that time, it is very difficult for the community to have access to the internet. So most of the neighborhood internet service at that time operated illegally, and because there are so many different group of RT-RW-Net spread all over Indonesia, and then in 2008, Indonesian government, because of the pressures of the community, formalized the use of 2.4 gigahertz frequency for the community. So the challenge of community network development in Indonesia, government only limit the internet service providers to state-owned enterprises, local government-owned enterprises, or private sector and cooperatives. So community network practice is hardly recognized in Indonesian policy framework. But because of the so many practice, and then 2019, the Ministry of Information and Telecommunication enacted a regulation number 13, 2009, 19. This regulation actually opens a possibility for any parties to develop a partnership with the internet service provider and become a reseller and a legal vendor. So, however, the procedure is too difficult, and also there is a power relation issues. So not many company actually willing to work with the community. This is why until now, most of the community-based internet service in Indonesia actually illegal. This is quite scary to see this is actually from last week that so many group of people who has initiative to do the community-based internet service actually have to deal with the police, and because they share the Wi-Fi without legal permit from the government. So actually in 2017, at least 200 practitioners of the RT/RW in Indonesia community network conducted a national meeting, and the question is actually still the same. They are seeking the answer for how actually to find a model of a more affordable, accessible, safe, and legal community-based internet. ICT Watch proposed the formation of RT/RW cooperatives as a formal institution for the community-based ISV. Until now, the cooperative actually has not been formed yet. There are so many different perspectives on this, and apparently we found out that some of the community based internet provider also turn into more business-like instead of community-based. So I would like to share the initial finding and lesson learned from the—
Hi, Prof. We have, sorry to interrupt, we just have 1 more minute. Thank you.
Okay, so I just make a very quick overview on research that we have conducted research for until 2023. We started our research in West Java, and then we aim to develop it into different region in Indonesia. So so we think that we still have some possibility to develop the community network because we have a successful project in Cipta Gelar, and we also see some movement from the community that actually really want to develop the community-based internet infrastructure. This is the Cipta Gelar. I think that I will jump into the conclusion that what we think about the policy in Indonesia. So we think that when we talk about digital divide, that we really need the policy support and also the model of collaborative governance to address that issues. And we also see that the role of multi-stakeholders engagement need to be improved to give equal access to digital skill and digital literacy. And we think that learning from Indonesian case, we think that the Indonesian policy should be more right-based and humanistic approach. And also there should be a more clear regulation on the legal status of community network. And we also need a universal access with meaningful connectivity, and also the improvement of human resource quality, skill, and knowledge. And also we need to develop a community-based and independent sustainable community network model because infrastructure is not enough. We also need to make it sustain and to train people to work and to be independent without any intervention from other parties. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Widyaningsih. It was a very wonderful presentation, and again, presenting the policy realities and application in Indonesia. I think what we have to be kept aware of is, for example, you told us the Ministry of Village Development of Disadvantaged Regions regulation around the village fund allocation to monitor this. And you mentioned the national movement GNLD of 2021, digital skills literacy. While it seems to be quite limited, it still could possibly be something to take a look at. And as well, how in 2019, ministry that opened the parties to develop partnerships with ISP to become a reseller. While it seems like a good movement, it's still finding difficulty to work with community members, and for us to watch around that. And also this possibility of if ICT Watch is still working with its members and partners to develop a cooperative. And of course, we will follow very closely the Chipagalar model to see if its demonstration of applying policy regulation will become fruitful. So thank you again, Prof, for your presentation. Any questions for Prof, please put on the chat. And I'd like to move to our next speaker, another professor. We have Professor Tariq Zaman from University of Technology Sarawak in Malaysia. He's associate professor and head of the Advanced Center for Sustainable Socioeconomic and Technological Development ASSET in the University of Technology Sarawak in Cebu, Malaysia. His research concentrates on co-designing technologies with children in indigenous communities, and having dual professional backgrounds as a lawyer and a professor in human-computer interaction. Prof. Tariq is concerned with co-designing human rights-based policy interventions to address digital inequalities. Well, that really follows on with what our previous speaker had around the humanistic approach. So let me pass on the microphone to you, Prof. Zaman.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yeah, to be very quick on the presentation that we can see it, I think we are behind the time. So let me share my screen first, and then from there, actually, I think we need to, yeah, let me, okay. So if you can see my screen all well, then I can continue.
Yes, we do. We can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay. So once again, thank you very much. So to be quick, and I will try to finish it in 10 minutes, my presentation. Continuing with the discussion before what Isha mentioned and Carlos, and with my colleague, Prophet Ida from Indonesia, I will not talk a lot about the current status of the policy discussion in Asia or in Malaysia, but our approach is much more related to practice-based and to explore the policy gaps or policy direction of Malaysia telecom industry and the government by establishing a local community network. And yes, this is not only my work, but with all my other colleagues. Malaysia is a beautiful picture when we really look at the readiness indexes and the affordability drivers without any doubt. And in the last few, like 20 years, Malaysia has a lot of many activities to focus on the rural connectivities. It includes Pusat Internal Telecenters project and village Wi-Fi, building towers, as well as the small initiatives, pilot projects. So there are a lot of these activities which is happening. We are based in the state of Sarawak, which is the largest state in Malaysia, but with a low density of population. And because of the low density of the population, access to internet and telecommunication is also one of the big challenges for the community and for the government also to provide the access to the people. Pandemic situation really bring out the challenges of the communities and for the people, what they are facing on the ground, and the situation becomes much more talk of the town and what is happening, and people had a lot of questions about it, that with all these previous years, with the huge investment, with so many activity intervention, why we still don't have access to meaningful internet. In the last few years, Malaysia government came up with the National Digital Connectivity Plan. They also call it Jendela, with high expectation of, and the debate started at the government level, that how internet can be considered as a third public utility, or many of the time it's also mentioned as a human rights. Internet connectivity as a human right. Um, uh, Currently, Jendela program is happening. We also have a Jendela map through which actually the people can access the status of internet in Malaysia, especially the 4G connectivity. If we come to the state of Sarawak, where we are based in, the state of Sarawak has their own intervention, specifically for the rural connectivity. We have the two very common, well-known intervention, which is one of that is called SMS Saluran, with the establishing of 300 tower, and the second one is My RSPN, which is called Sarawak Rural Broadband Network. 194 side, 45,000 homes will be connected with the 30 Mbps of internet speed. Please keep in mind, this is the internet speed. It doesn't mention about the upload and the download speed. Based on our study, we were looking at that what are the current challenges at the policy level, then the supply side challenges, also as well as the demand side challenges. In terms of the policies intervention are not really clear. We don't have a very clear policy about community network, but we are very recently exploring class license, which is a very specific license, and we applied last week actually for our first community network under the class license, and we will have our next meeting with the ministry on 20th of this month, who would like to explore more that actually what it is this community network that we want to establish. So the negotiation and the discussion is starting. Other than that is the diverse and inclusive approach. Inconsistent terminology is another part. Currently, the government is saying that 4G internet until end of this year in populated area, but how the populated area is defined, it's not yet clear. So there are these type of terminologies in policy documents which is not really yet open. Lack of empirical evidences at the supply side, that is another component. Impact study, all these interventions which are happening for the last 20 years, we don't have really good impact study which can tell us that what is the current situation of these BDD interventions. And then the use cases is another component. I will talk maybe a little more about that one in the next stage. The demand side challenges is unclear monitoring mechanism. Currently, the quality of service of internet at the rural areas or even in the urban area is not clear, that how the communities can monitor and can report what is the current status. The user side, the user experience is not yet on the map. Lack of the digital tools and technologies, that is another component of how we are going to report the status of the internet in my village or in my school or at my, that is one another component. If there is only one internet, one way of connecting to the internet, and that is down, there is no other way to call to report the current status of the internet. And then what Ida also mentioned from the humanistic perspective, we're also looking at that if the government is really talking about internet as a human right or internet as a utility, then do the local community, the people really know their rights, the consumer right, the knowledge, consumer knowledge, and the lack of even the tools and or the lack of the capacity to claim those rights is another component. So let me go quickly to the intervention that we have currently working on. This is one of our intervention with the support of APNIC, where we are looking for on the impact study of the existing internet intervention which government has established. For example, My RSPN, Pusat Internet, those ones at the local level, and then from there we can see that okay, what are the government current policies and how the impacts and what are the programs designed based on those current policies, and what are the impacts on the ground. So we are working on this in this project. Dr. Razala is one of my colleague and postdoc fellow who is looking at this component. The second one is establishing our first community network. Gary Lowe is my PhD student, is working on this, establishing a community-based community network, really including engaging the local community in the community-based co-design approaches, where the community values actually lead or shape the community network. It is the combination of the co-design processes and training. Just our first community network, which we have currently established, and we have applied for the community network license. There are also the government My RSBN facilities also available in the same village. We have last week we were in the village and we tested the internet speed. The government provided support, is providing upload speed of 1.57 and download speed is still okay, fine, 27 Mbps. The current challenge is that with all these e-learning and the problem for which this My RSBN and the other initiatives are there, with that low upload speed, it will be one of the big challenge in our community network, which is on the other side. 27.7 is the upload speed, which is quite fine for them. So the community is saying can access the internet through both way, but they really prefer the access to the community net because of the speed. So that is another part. The other one is about the quality of services and the meaningful connectivity part and the right-based approach. We are preparing training for the local community members to really understand their consumer rights for what they are paying and what they are getting in. But for that, actually, we need to go into more detailed study of the ITU standard as well as the MCMC, the Malaysian government regulatory authority, their monitoring mechanism. And some of the things which we really found is that, for example, the upload speed for the mobile internet, it is not measured. And that's why the upload speed is usually very low, very low in the rural areas. And because of the upload speed, the services like e-learning is not really possible at the rural areas. So the policy is really silent about that component, which we would like to bring it up. And then if the community can better understand that how the internet and networks work, they may be better in making a decision and claiming their rights. Okay, so the last one is about the quality of service monitoring and reporting tools. The current tool which is available in terms of the map, which is telling you that what is the current status of internet in the rural area in Malaysia or in the urban area in Malaysia, is the Jendela map, which is not accessible outside Malaysia, but it is just telling you about not about the user experience, but the telecommunication company reported status of the internet coverage. So we are looking from the other way around, that if the local community can also report what is the current status of internet upload and download speed and latency at their side, and the policy maker can actually monitor it on their the user experience. So we are designing this map with the MLab technologies currently with their framework. So with this, thank you very much. What are the really lessons learned from our side for this whole process? We are not yet at that stage that we can really generalize our lesson learned, but one of the way or one of the things that I would like to mention is here, that really to understand the policy gaps, I think this whole process of going through establishing the services may open us more broader understanding of what is happening, how things are, where are the lacking points, and where are the gaps. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Tariq Zaman, for your presentation and really the beginning stages of this co-design of the first community network in Malaysia. You brought up some great points around like the national digital connectivity Plan, Jindela, as well as what is happening in Sarawak with the two options of connectivity. And as well, we're looking forward to learning more about how the application goes from last week on the class license and your forthcoming meeting with the ministry on the 20th of April. I really do think we have a lot to learn as you're describing a kind of action research process where not only researching the policies that are currently in existence and working with the ministry on possibly finding the right way forward for community-based initiatives that would like to apply for license. So I do appreciate this this first presentation on how action research takes place in Malaysia Sarawak conditions. So with that note, we have our fifth speaker, and she's coming from our partner here in Learn Asia in Sri Lanka. Gayani Hural is the research manager at Learn Asia. She's researching digital policy and regulation and the future of work. She has also been an external consultant at EY, where she's conducting World Bank digital economy assessments for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. So I will pass it on to Gayani for our last presentation, and then we have our open forum and closing remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen. Are you able to see my screen?
I am.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. First, thank you so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. And what I'm going to do quite quickly is going to take a step back from the very insightful country-specific perspectives that many of our other speakers have given, and instead give you a very overarching 10,000-foot view of the policy and regulatory landscape around community networks in South and Southeast Asia. And what I'm going to do is to draw upon findings that we've really come across in a study that we're doing along with APC. So with Carlos, Kathleen, Sarbani, and the wider team, drawing on both desk research as well as interviews we've done with various type of entities across the region. So we're talking about government officials like regulators, people who worked at big telcos, community networks, as well as international organizations who give both technical and financial assistance. So what we're trying to do is really capture a variety of views and really looking at this space from a regional perspective. Before I start, very quickly, I'll give you some context on where I'm coming from. I'm from an organization called Learn Asia. We're a think tank. We work in infrastructure policy broadly, including energy, water, and telecommunications, but digital policy is really where a lot of our focus has been in the past few years. We're based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, but we work across the Asia Pacific, particularly in South and Southeast Asia. Our work centers around doing research and then taking it to policy. So you'll see some of these elements in my presentation today. Right, sorry. All right. So in this slide, I'm going to focus on some of these elements in which are very present in our space, which many of you are likely very familiar with, but I'm going to lay out the landscape very quickly, just to give a sense of where we're coming from. So through our research, we found that there are multiple elements that are required to keep community networks going. And some of these are very fundamental, like not directly policy related, but crucial to keep things going. So this includes having governments being aware of community networks, there being unconnected communities with an appetite for use, as well as dynamic community structures and leadership as a base for getting community networks going. But there are also lots of policy elements to consider. So some of these are simply telecom related matters, licensing, spectrum, access to backhaul technology, and so on. Many of the speakers before have touched on these elements really wonderfully. So I'm not going to talk further about this. What I'd like to spend a little time talking about are the non-policy, like non-telecom policy, but yet policy elements, which plays into this community network landscape. So we can talk about a couple of things. I'll talk about two things. First is about, say, training, right? So how do we get the right people with the right skills to actually set up and run the networks? right? It's quite important, along with thinking about telecom regulation, to think about this space, because this has implications on the formal education system within a country. Sometimes there are also trade elements that we need to think about. So when doing our interviews, we've heard time and time again that telecom equipment is quite expensive. So again, in order to make this more affordable, there's certainly a need to see if something can be handled from a trade policy perspective. So for example, seeing whether your country can sign the WTO's IT agreement, which will slash tariffs related to IT and telecom products. So our sense there is that it's important to think about the entire landscape there, because all of it is going to have some sort of impact on the entire space. Now I'd like to spend some time talking about the region in which we operate, right? And we know that Asia is quite diverse, but what we found is that even within the sub-regions, there's a lot of diversity, and you certainly see this even in a ASEAN landscape. So we'll take a look at South Asia, right, which is where I'm from, and you look at Sri Lanka. There's very little awareness on community networks. Even when we've gone and spoken to our regulators, they were largely unaware of this. There's little to no community networks present, perhaps outside very pilot projects that have happened a while ago. And the regulatory environment is largely unconducive, right? And it's unconducive not only because, you know, licensing spectrum regulations don't allow for community networks to operate, but also because the legal infrastructure is inconducive. So our Telecommunications Act was last amended in 1996, and we've told that unless this is amended, it's tough to get many of the other elements going. We know internally that they've been trying to amend the act since 2008, but very, very little success. So things do move very slowly. But again, from a regional perspective, if you take Sri Lanka versus some of our neighbors in South Asia, such as India and Pakistan, you'll see they're a little bit more developed, right? And Isha spoke about the Indian context in length. And even then we found from ASEAN landscape, they seem to be further ahead, partly because there are community networks there in the first place, right? So DEF, GroundNAC, Air Jaldi, and so on. And although there are fundamental issues like the lack of language and around scenes and policy documents and so on, which are very, very important, they do seem to be several steps ahead of countries like Sri Lanka, given that it's at least acknowledged in tri-consultations, right? So my point is that Asia itself is quite diverse and we have different starting points. We also noticed then really when looking at the landscape to set up community networks, that we do need to look at several other elements. And I'll talk about one right now, which is geography. So historically, one of the reasons why it's been difficult to set up, make a case for community networks in Sri Lanka outside things like our legal system, is that we have a higher population density nationwide. But in countries with a more geographically dispersed populations, like small island nations and countries with more terrestrial lands, it's been easier to make a case for community networks. And one of our research fellows who's worked in community networks in the Pacific Islands, for example, was talking about how community networks was so transformative as a means of getting access to healthcare and education, and really driving access to many other services there. But that being said, certainly with the COVID-19 pandemic, the need for the internet to become a means to get access to other types of services, certainly there could be a reframing to make a case for even other countries which were certainly have a higher population density, because there could be other small pockets of land that are still unconnected. So there is some reframing that could be done from that lens. But now, despite all these differences within Asia, we've noticed and certainly have been told during our in-depth interviews that there are some distinctly Asian characteristics that we do need to consider in policy engagement. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from. One of the big questions that we had around community networks is that Asia seemed to be kind of in a flux. So we had especially when compared to other regions, right? Latin America and Africa. If you look at the average internet use, you'll see in Latin America, internet use is much higher than Asia. And if you look at Africa, you'll see that the number of internet users, certainly per 100, is lower than Asia. But community networks seem less popular in Asia compared to the two of them. So our question was really why. And there were a couple of things that we picked up on, mainly on the supply side. And this isn't exhaustive, but things to possibly start thinking about. So the first is less flexible regulations. So you'll see that Latin America gives out a lot more social purpose licenses. Carlos spoke to you about a number of new spectrum, NBMO type examples as well, which gives an indication that their regimes are somewhat more conducive. But Asia seems to be behind in keeping up from that regulatory lens. And a lot of Africa has come online after Asia. So there's perhaps more technical assistance that they've got at a later stage, which makes their regulations and regimes a bit more pliable, so to speak. There's seemingly more bureaucracy in Asia, which I'm sure many of you have seen and experienced. We've heard that there's a higher risk aversion in Asia, so a tendency to be more content with current systems. We've learned that over time, there's a need to give out a lot more detailed reports and quantified evidence to convince Asian policymakers. Another sort of difference is the lack of syncing of political and technical advocacy in the two countries. There are other regions in which they seem to work together, but in Asia, they seem to work in silos, at least in some of the countries that we work in. The fifth worth mentioning is language diversity. So again, if you take the Latin American regions, there are primarily 2 languages spoken around the region. But in ours, there are many, many more, even within countries. So there's less information sharing and collaboration. Perhaps a side note is there's also, more foreign relations kind of frigidity, which also perhaps leads to less collaboration. But less collaboration is certainly seen in this part of the world. Now, we've spent some time musing and setting the stage on what it means to work in Asia. So very quickly, I'd like to talk about the way forward. And our sense is that it's very important to approach these stakeholders, particularly who are not conducive to science, but to do that, we need to really build a coalition, right? This could mean asking other governments who have successful regimes to share their experiences, because what we've heard is that governments, particularly regulators like, peer learning, this could mean convening experts who have worked in this country or similar spaces to share their views. It could mean finding funding opportunities and actually showing that there are funding opportunities to the regulators, because even when we've started talking to regulators, the first thing that they ask us is, where do you get the money for this? So really pool resources and experiences to get going. When approaching governments, we've learned that it's really important to take an evidence-based approach. Again, this ties back to this risk aversion point that we spoke about earlier. So making sure that we have a lot of numbers, but certainly also bringing in human stories to show who and how it can benefit people. Use this to build awareness among stakeholders, and then make sure your policy and legal documents are conducive. Again, going back to the case of Sri Lanka or possibly India, and then working on the regulatory space. So we've kind of laid this out in a semi-systematic manner, but we understand that many of this is going to be iterative, but we do understand that sometimes you need to go through a certain set of steps to really get to your end goal. So that's what we've tried to put in here, of course, while managing, understanding policy sentiment and navigating all this red tape and bureaucracy. So I'll stop from here and, let the conversation go forward. I'm really excited to hear what's going to come out in the open forum, and happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gayani, for this 10,000-foot view of policy and regulation for CNs in Asia. I mean, I think you really have brought us all together coming from all the different national studies and giving us a bit of a food for thought on the particular nuances and context of Asia, and also proposing a way forward around coalition building, peer learning, and certainly using the evidence-based approach in proceeding forward in the Asia region if we want to create an enabling policy environment for community networks in the region. So I think at this point, I'd like to invite all of our speakers to come online with me to be part of the open forum. I see Gayani here. Let me see who else has been coming online. And also I know that we are running 15, sorry, we're reaching now the hour, and we're asking speakers and participants if it's possible to enable us 15 more minutes to allow for the open forum and closing remarks. I think it's been worthwhile. We had, I was been watching consistently around 42 participants who've been listening intently. And I really do hope that they now have some questions that they'd like to pose to the group who are available here. I do see some questions that were previously posed, and I don't know if those would like to be kind of the beginning stage, but let me go back. I do see a participant named Jude Esguerra asking about, coming from the Philippines, and speaking around that they're in the Philippines have thousands of coastal communities, and has the argument been made by Indonesian authorities that the blue economy, okay, he was speaking about, fish stocks and fishing gear, well, and whether the blue economy has to be digital. Do you think the financing enabling of community Wi-Fi business models in coastal areas can piggyback on public programs for the blue economy? Now, this is interesting, this piggybacking, you're talking about blue economy, but we certainly know when we look at other sectors like education and health and local economy business, that these have been also ways of, let's say, piggybacking with community networks. Perhaps we can go a bit broader and speak to where we've seen this, and if enabling policy. I mean, we already talked about the Village Fund, where it's about village-based economy development to be developed using the policy. So let's open it up if there's those who'd like to speak of this piggybacking with CNs and certain sectors like blue economy. Perhaps Prof. Ida, you want to go first, and then others who'd like to come in.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Actually, one of our research area, some of the community develop community-based internet practice, and they try to create their own apps to monitor the fishery area. But this is a shrimp, actually, not offshore. This is onshore. I think that you are right that actually Indonesia will need internet for the community to monitor and to use in the fishery sector. However, at this moment, to my knowledge, that on that kind of technology owned by the government, and the community doesn't have access to that. Because my research conducted in the border of Indonesia and Singapore, for example, they had no internet access at all. So this is very difficult for Indonesian, not only for common people, for local government, village government as well. It is very difficult. They have no access to the internet. This is why most of the time they couldn't catch up with the new information. But I think you are right that actually the argument on blue economy could be, we can explore that for more, because Indonesia actually want to move to more sustainable economy, even in the village level. The government also now introduced new instrument to measure the sustainable development goals at village level. but it is just started. But I think this is a very good question, and I think that I will try to integrate that question and how to look at the blue economy as the reason to strengthen the argument that community network is very important, because we have to open more access to the community in Indonesia, especially those who live in village and some remote region. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very good points around, the possibilities of monitoring, and one example of the shrimps monitoring that is taking place, but yet where is the citizen monitoring availability, and whether that is a possibility in some of the communities where we operate. Perhaps there's others who'd like to come in around not only blue economy sector, but piggybacking CNs with other sector initiatives that is possible as entry points.
Okay, if there's no more comment, I think that I missed some point on funding. Yes, at this moment we have some possibility to relocate village funding from the government to set up the internet for community. I think that in terms of building infrastructure is possible, but another thing is how to negotiate with private sector who has ISP monopoly. So this is another issue. So because most of the, at this moment, what we did in Ciptagelar is the most possible model, because this is like semi-illegal, but it is legal. So I think that this is why we have to start it very from the area that is not really becoming the interest of the business sector. So we have to find the area that actually far and not really profitable for the business. Then we can work on community network. So we couldn't compete with the big business. So we have to start from those who are marginalized. So this is why I'm thinking that right-based issue will be the best argument at this moment for Indonesia. So we couldn't, I mean that because the business model also work with the bureaucracy, so it is very difficult to compete with them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good, again, some very good points around, coming back to the Ciptagelar example of, having a demonstration done where it's a lot more far away from where major, monopoly or where a lot of operators are operating, to first demonstrate the test of whether the CN will operate well in these conditions. And again, trying to make partnerships with ISPs and negotiating is a challenge, given the type of regulation that allows community networks to operate. So is there others that like to chip in regards to whether it be coming back to this question about sector, or around negotiating with local service providers in order to CNs to operate in the community level? I think I'm gonna call out, if it's okay, Carlos, because I see his thinking hand there, and he always has some interesting thoughts to this regard. And I see that also take a look. There's a few more questions I'd like to scroll up to, so let me head over to Carlos for some thoughts, and then scroll up so I could find the other questions that have been posed.
Hi. So I can give a proper answer. Can you please summarize the question again, so I go to the point?
I mean, I think we're still talking about kind of this one around community networks kind of piggybacking with other sectors. So the one participant spoke about the blue sector. Is there possibilities of piggybacking with other sectors? I'd mentioned education with community networks, healthcare with community networks, some of their possible, regulations that, because you're piggybacking with, like, say, education, that it could become more conducive in getting the results of policy that you're looking for. And the other was around allocation of funding. In the case that was discussed was around whether maybe, finding ways to use current funding mechanisms to bring the community network through. Maybe other sectors would be able to provide similar conditions.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry. Yeah, and I was thinking about that, but just wanted to be clear. So when I was talking about public support for community networks from other departments, a big component comes from innovation and comes from science and industry, or science and technology. I think there are a lot of work to be done there because of the innovative way of dealing with a problem that the market hasn't been able to deal with, right? So there has been support in South Africa, in Mexico, in other countries that come from that innovation flavor, maybe through, as I said, the Department of Science and Technology, Science and Innovation, wherever it is in your country, could be an interesting one. I think Ida was talking about rural development and small businesses. There are different policies and potential interesting synergies now that there is the digitalization of the small businesses, and how they are not, they are seen, and there are many small businesses in rural and remote areas that could receive that access and that need that access in order to be part of that digital transformation, but that they could also be part of providing that access and becoming part of that digital transformation from the other side, not only from the demand side, but from the supply side. I think there are also elements in relation to energy. I would say, I'm sure in many of the Asian countries, although I haven't been much in the region, energy is an issue, and community networks and any network require energy. And with the clean, with the climate change policies that probably are being implemented and providing alternative sources of energy into rural and remote areas, there could be a hand in hand. There are many small businesses that are specializing in the provision of solar systems, and with those solar systems, they could be, the network, like those solar, let's say, energy providers, they need some sort of a mindset, a financial training, a business thinking, that could be hand in hand with the networks themselves. And there are definitely funds to green whatever, the development of rural and remote areas. And finally, e-government. I think we've seen this from the very beginning. There are many more and more government services that they want to, be democratized, not only education, not only health, but access to, I don't know, grants, access to applications, access to whatever paperwork that might be required, where it might be that there are also potential synergies to piggyback on. So all in all, at the end of the day, is within the digitalization and anything that can come with it. So yeah, anyway. That's
really great points, Carlos. So those are excellent complementary models, sectors that, rural development, small businesses. I know South Africa also has a Ministry of Small Businesses, digital transformation sectors like solar energy, energy provider, alternative energy provision, e-government, as we've seen in a couple of community networks where they try to enable e-government services, grants, for the rural areas, and use the community network as that entry point for that. And Isha, you have your hand up. I did see you nodding on a few of the points that were being made. Go for it.
I just wanted to add to what Carlos is saying and also what Ida was saying. I just wanted to mention it. And I think the important part is like piggybacking would help, or at least I speak from the Indian experience, is that there are certain sort of pet themes that are always ahead in the funding cycle also for the government, right? Carlos mentioned innovation, science and tech. And the other thing that really I feel in the past couple of years has become the central theme is rural livelihood, where you could provide opportunity, setting up small scale industries. Traditional handicraft industry in India per se is like, say, very rich. And I feel there is definitely a case to be made for having some synergies between these overlapping boundaries. Like I remember Sarvani saying that with the gram mark, they're trying to set up how that community becomes a sustainable sort of a model. And I think the tricky bit is that it's more like the chicken and egg situation, unless and until that we have that particular model in place that we could then take to the policymakers and say that, hey, we made this work here. And if you sort of give us the money, we could replicate or emulate successful models in some of these other areas. The other opportunity that we've sort of also identified in India is that the Ministry of Electronics has been trying to talk a lot about internet in local languages, right? And making internet for all. India is a very, very linguistically diverse country, and we do face a very, very valid language sort of a barrier. And to bridge that, if these, say, community networks, and there is a lot of local content out there on the internet, if so I feel we have these pockets of work that is happening, but the challenge has been that may have been too siloed till this point. You have a lot of siloed regulatory policy making back home in India. You have METI, you have telecom department, you have the small scale industry sitting in another chamber. So there is a need to sort of have a model that we could then go back and talk to them, because unfortunately or fortunately, even in the government's list of priorities, unless and until they see a scalable option, they're not going to sort of give you the money. And that's the sort of harsh truth that is there.
No, thanks, Isha. And I think that is it. From what I'm hearing, it really comes down to the, meaningful purpose of the community network, and then thereby, developing that model that could be demonstrated to policymakers that this indeed is an option forward to provide, whether it's the specific, local language issue or the small business rural livelihood option. It is to provide that case that that can be shown as evidence of the success of community networks, and thereby using that case to drive further policy that enables community networks to thrive. So I think we are reaching now beyond the hour, and I do appreciate some of the questions coming through. It seems that we might need to organize an even separate one specifically around the Philippines, around connectivity, telco. I do see messages from Philip Martinez and others from Department of Science Tech from Philippines to know more about organizations in the Philippines who are active in community networks. And I wonder if perhaps we can collect those names so that we can organize maybe a meeting or further discussion specifically around the Philippines to enable that discussion. Because at this point, I do want to hand it over to our dear partner in this this wonderful series in ISEA to I'm hoping she is there. Is Dr. Marie? There she is.
I'm here, Kathleen. Yes, I've been a
Wonderful.
silent
Dr. Day.
listener.
Welcome. Thank
But
you.
yeah, I'm really very happy about the turnout of this 3-session learning activity that we organized. I'm really pleased to partner with APC and to partner with your partners, of course, in these technological innovations for sustainable development. You bring in a lot of experience, I think, and expertise that we don't have. But I think the whole point about synergy that was being discussed on the question of piggybacking, that I think our main interest is really linking the addressing of sustainability issues of community networks with local economy building. And I think that is the strength that the social enterprise sector's interest in working with community network practitioners and enablers is, I think, together, we're hoping that we would be able to address these synergies. And in relation to that, I'd like to, of course, thank the speakers, Carlos, Isha, Professor Ida, Professor Tariq, and Gayani for the wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot. I'm still learning a lot about community networks, but also that we will be uploading the learning sessions. No, if you know of friends and people who are interested to actually access the learning sessions, we will be uploading them in the website of the Technological Innovations for Sustainable Development platform. And I'd like to just end by inviting everyone to act on what we have been learning on this in these 3 learning sessions. No, we have a Technological Innovations for Sustainable Development platform, and that's meant to be a learning platform. It's meant to be an advocacy platform. It's meant to project collective impact, and it's meant to do resource mobilization so that we can actually bring technological innovations for sustainable development to become more responsive to the needs of poverty and marginalized sectors. And community networks are our focus in this platform. So I hope that you are those of you who are here who are interested to bring this to action will come to join us as members of the platform. It's open for membership. I see some of our social enterprise colleagues here, and I hope that you can enlist to become members of the platform. Second, I think the policy work needs to be brought forward, and those of you who are interested in policy work for the platform, please also enlist for that. And lastly, in terms of the learning community among and between social enterprises and community network practitioners and enablers, we're hoping that we could continue these learning sessions with you. So thank you very much for a very fruitful set of learning sessions, and we look forward to working more closely with APC and its partners in Technological Innovations for Sustainable Development platform. And we hope that those of you who joined us this afternoon can become active stakeholders of that platform. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I mean, really, we are very pleased to be part of this learning platform. I definitely believe that it is a way to keep the discussion going, so that it's not just reduced to only these 3 learning sessions, but for the conversation to continue, and particularly in the Asia region. I think this is going to be an opportune moment to keep the learning going. So I think on that note, I'd like to thank again our partners, ISEA, for helping us to set up this fantastic series, 3 series, and for us to be able to partner together with these wonderful speakers to learn more about community networks in Asia. And at this note, I wish you all good afternoon and good evening. Some of you still good morning. Have a wonderful day. And thank you to the ISEA Comms team as well, Gomer, Bads, and all in the background who've been supporting us throughout the series.
Thank you so much.